In 2004, Jamal Williams and Lakeisha Johnson met at a charity event in Chicago, Illinois. At the time, Jamal was 35 years old and already a successful entrepreneur, owning a chain of car dealerships across the Midwest. His confidence and generosity immediately caught Lakeisha's attention. Lakeisha, then 32 years old, was working as an elementary school teacher on the south side of Chicago. She was a single mother to her 10-year-old daughter, Tamika Johnson, from a previous marriage. Jamal's charisma, his ability to command a room, and his apparent dedication to his business impressed Lakeisha. Their romance developed quickly, and within a year they were married. Lakeisha's daughter, Tamika, was 10 years old when Jamal entered their lives. Jamal accepted Tamika as his own, making a concerted effort to be a good stepfather. He attended her school events, helped with her homework, and generally tried to fill the void left by Tamika's biological father, who had been largely absent from her life. Jamal's presence seemed to bring stability to the family. On the surface, their life together appeared perfect. A successful husband, a loving and dedicated wife, and a happy, well-adjusted family. Over the next decade, Jamal's business continued to thrive. He expanded his dealerships into neighboring states, and his reputation as a respected businessman grew. Lakeisha, after several years of teaching, decided to leave her job and focus on managing their home and supporting Tamika, who was now a teenager. The family lived in a large house in a quiet, upscale neighborhood in the Chicago suburbs. However, subtle changes began to appear in their family dynamic. Lakeisha noticed that Jamal was becoming more distant, often working late or spending time away from home on business trips. Tamika, now a teenager, also seemed to be growing apart from her mother, spending more time in her room or out with friends. Lakeisha initially attributed these changes to the normal stresses of life. Jamal's business was demanding, and Tamika was simply going through the typical phase. Despite these concerns, Lakeisha remained committed to her family. She continued to manage the household, ensuring that everything was taken care of while Jamal focused on his business and Tamika on her studies. She believed that whatever issues they were facing could be resolved with time and patience. After all, they had built a life together over the years, and Lakeisha had no reason to doubt the strength of their family. In 2014, as their 10th wedding anniversary approached, Lakeisha began to reflect on the life they had created together. She thought about how much had changed since that night at the charity event when she first met Jamal. Their relationship had evolved from a whirlwind romance to a stable partnership, one that had weathered the ups and downs of life. Yet, as she looked back on the past decade, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The once vibrant connection between her and Jamal seemed to have faded, replaced by a sense of routine and distance. Tamika, too, seemed to be keeping up appearances, excelling in her studies and preparing to start college in the fall. As the anniversary approached, Jamal surprised Lakeisha with plans for a lavish celebration. He arranged for a weekend getaway to a luxury resort. Lakeisha was touched by the gesture, seeing it as a sign that Jamal was still committed to their marriage. She hoped that this trip would reignite the spark that had brought them together so many years ago. However, beneath the surface, the cracks in their marriage were widening. Jamal Williams is a charismatic and respected businessman in the Chicago area. At 45, he owns several car dealerships not only in Chicago but also in neighboring cities, establishing a solid reputation for himself as a successful entrepreneur. His business acumen, combined with his ability to connect with people, has made him a well-known figure in his community. Jamal has always taken great care to maintain the image of an ideal husband and stepfather, ensuring that his family life reflects the same level of success as his business ventures. From the outside, Jamal appears to have it all: a thriving business, a beautiful home, and a loving family. He is the kind of man who is often seen at community events, shaking hands, making donations, and offering support to local initiatives. People who know Jamal describe him as confident, generous, and always in control. He has cultivated this image carefully over the years, understanding the importance of perception in both business and personal life. However, beneath this polished exterior, Jamal is a man who is increasingly distant from his own family. Over the past few years, the demands of his business have grown, requiring more of his time and attention. He spends long hours at work, frequently traveling to oversee operations at his various dealerships. These business obligations have become a convenient excuse for his growing absence at home. He rationalizes his absence by focusing on the material comforts he can provide: a nice house, expensive gifts, and a stable lifestyle. But in reality, his increasing detachment is not just a matter of work. It is also a reflection of deeper issues within himself and his marriage. Lakeisha Williams, formerly Lakeisha Johnson, is 42 years old and has devoted the past several years of her life to her family. Her role as a homemaker has given her a sense of purpose, but it has also isolated her. In many ways, Leisha's focus has also shifted towards her daughter, Tamika, who has grown from a little girl into a young woman. As Tamika prepares to enter adulthood, Lakeisha worries about the challenges she will face. She is determined to support her daughter in every way possible, but she also fears that the growing distance in her marriage might affect Tamika's perception of relationships. Tamika Johnson, now 18 years old, is Leisha's daughter from a previous marriage. She is currently a freshman at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where she is studying psychology. Tamika has always been a bright and ambitious young woman, eager to prove herself and make her mother proud. Growing up without her biological father, Tamika struggled with feelings of abandonment and a deep longing for paternal approval. When Jamal entered her life 10 years ago, Tamika initially viewed him with caution. But over time, Jamal's efforts to be a caring stepfather won her over. He attended her school events, offered guidance, and treated her as his own daughter. For Tamika, Jamal became the father figure she had always wanted. Attention and approval meant the world to her, filling a void that had existed for most of her childhood. As Tamika entered her teenage years, her relationship with Jamal became more complex. While she still craved his approval, she also began to notice the growing distance between him and her mother. This change unsettled her, and she found herself drawn even closer to Jamal, seeking his attention in ways that went beyond the typical stepfather-stepdaughter relationship. Tamika's need for validation, combined with the emotional gaps in her life, led her to develop a deep attachment to Jamal. As the year progressed, the dynamics between Jamal and Tamika began to shift in subtle yet significant ways. Jamal, who had always prided himself on being a caring and attentive stepfather, found himself increasingly drawn to Tamika in a manner that went beyond the typical boundaries of their relationship. His initial efforts to guide and support her as she navigated the challenges of her first year at the University of Illinois in Chicago started to take on a more personal and intimate tone. Jamal, who had always maintained a close relationship with Tamika, began to spend more time with her, often finding excuses to be alone. He would offer to help her with her studies, give her rides to and from the university, or take her out for dinner under the guise of bonding. These moments of interaction, while seemingly innocent, were laced with an underlying tension that neither Jamal nor Tamika could fully ignore. The lines between paternal care, personal affection became blurred, and Tamika, who had always craved male validation, began to see Jamal in a new light. Jamal, on the other hand, became acutely aware of the power he held over Tamika. Her dependence on him, coupled with her growing admiration, gave him a sense of control that he found both thrilling and intoxicating. He began to push the boundaries of their relationship, testing how far he could go without arousing suspicion. Simple gestures like a touch on the shoulder or a compliment on her appearance started to carry more weight. The once clear lines of appropriate behavior were gradually being redrawn, and both Jamal and Tamika were complicit in the process. The relationship reached a new level one evening when Jamal offered to drive Tamika back to her dorm after a late-night study session. The conversation started off as it always did, discussing her classes and her plans for the weekend. But as they neared her dorm, Jamal made a comment about how much she had matured over the past year. It was a seemingly harmless statement, but the way he said it, with a certain look in his eyes, made Tamika's heart race. She responded with a shy smile. The unspoken attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface was now out in the open, though neither of them dared to acknowledge it directly. Jamal began to find more reasons to spend time alone with Tamika, and their conversations grew increasingly personal and intimate. They started exchanging text messages late at night, messages that gradually became more flirtatious and suggestive. What had started as innocent check-ins evolved into something much more charged. Both of them knew that what they were doing was wrong, yet they found themselves unable to stop. The secrecy of their relationship added to its allure. Jamal took great care to ensure that Lakeisha remained unaware of what was happening. He deleted text messages, avoided being alone with Tamika when Lakeisha was around, and maintained his image as the devoted husband and father. Yet the strain of leading a double life began to wear on him. The guilt of betraying his wife, coupled with the constant fear of being discovered, weighed heavily on Jamal. As the months passed, Lakeisha began to notice increasingly unsettling changes in the way Jamal and Tamika interacted. Their once open and relaxed relationship had become marked by a new level of secrecy. Conversations between them grew quieter, often ending abruptly when Lakeisha entered the room. The glances they exchanged were filled with tension that Lakeisha couldn't ignore. Small details that would have gone unnoticed in the past now seemed to carry significant weight. Jamal's sudden interest in Tamika's activities, the way they both seemed overly cautious around her, and how Tamika's demeanor shifted whenever Jamal was nearby. Lakeisha's unease turned to suspicion. She began to observe them more closely, looking for signs that might explain the growing distance between her and Jamal, and the increasingly odd behavior of her daughter. Her intuition told her that something was terribly wrong, but she struggled to find concrete evidence. On the evening of September 15, 2015, Lakeisha's suspicions were confirmed in the most devastating way. She had been cleaning the living room when she noticed Jamal's phone lying unattended on the coffee table. Without fully understanding why, she picked it up, intending only to move it aside. As she held the phone, a message notification from Tamika appeared on the screen. The preview of the message was innocuous enough, but it was the familiarity of the tone that made Lakeisha pause. Her heart pounded in her chest as she unlocked the phone, her hands trembling slightly. What she found shattered her world. The messages exchanged between Jamal and Tamika were not just affectionate. They were intimate in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. The words on the screen revealed the full extent of their relationship, detailing plans to meet in secret, confessions of love, and a level of emotional connection that was utterly inappropriate. Lakeisha felt a wave of nausea as she read through the messages, each word driving a knife deeper into her heart. The betrayal was staggering not just because of the affair itself, but because it involved her own daughter. Shaking with anger and disbelief, Lakeisha confronted Jamal as soon as he returned home that evening. Her emotions, which had been simmering just below the surface, erupted as she demanded an explanation. The confrontation was immediate and intense, with Lakeisha's voice rising as she hurled accusations at Jamal. He attempted to deflect at first, denying the seriousness of the messages and claiming that it was all a misunderstanding. But the evidence was undeniable and Lakeisha refused to back down. Faced with the undeniable truth, Jamal's defenses crumbled. The confident, composed businessman who had always been in control now stood exposed and vulnerable. He admitted to the affair, though his admission was reluctant and filled with excuses. Jamal tried to rationalize his actions, claiming that it had started innocently, that he had only wanted to help Tamika through a difficult time. But as the truth spilled out, it became clear that his motivations were far from innocent. The relationship had evolved into something far darker, driven by his desire for control and the emotional power he wielded over Tamika. Lakeisha listened in stunned silence, her initial rage giving way to a deep, consuming pain. The man she had loved and trusted had betrayed her in the worst possible way, not just with another woman but with her own daughter. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming, as was the realization that her family was irrevocably shattered. Everything she had believed about her marriage, her husband, and her life was now in question. Tamika, who had been upstairs when the confrontation began, soon became aware of the escalating argument. The raised voices drew her to the living room, where she found her mother and Jamal locked in a heated exchange. The sight of her mother's tear-streaked face and Jamal's defeated posture sent a wave of guilt crashing over her. She knew instantly what had happened, and the weight of her own role in the situation became unbearable. Caught between her loyalty to her mother and her complicated feelings for Jamal, Tamika was paralyzed with fear and guilt. She had never intended for things to go this far, but now there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. Her mother's pain was evident, and Tamika knew that she was partly responsible for it. The reality of the situation was stark and unforgiving. The affair had destroyed the very foundation of their family. Lakeisha, unable to contain her emotions any longer, broke down completely. She screamed at Jamal, demanding to know how he could betray her so deeply, how he could involve their daughter in something so wrong. Jamal had no answers that could satisfy her, no explanations that could mend the damage he had done. Tamika, standing in the doorway, was frozen by the intensity of the scene unfolding before her. The guilt she felt was suffocating, and the fear of what would happen next kept her rooted to the spot. She wanted to flee, to escape the unbearable weight of the situation, but she couldn't move. The reality of the moment was inescapable, and she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Jamal had spent the day trying to salvage what was left of his dignity, but the damage was irreparable. His attempts to placate Lakeisha only seemed to fuel her anger further. The once charming and composed businessman now found himself the target of Lakeisha's seething wrath. The emotional confrontation had left everyone frayed and vulnerable, and as the night wore on, the tension became unbearable. As Lakeisha's anger spiraled out of control, she retreated to the kitchen, desperate to find some way to cope with her overwhelming emotions. In a moment of sheer desperation, she grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter. The knife was large, with a gleaming blade that seemed to reflect the harsh light of the kitchen. Holding it tightly, Lakeisha returned to the living room, where Jamal and Tamika were still trying to make sense of the chaos. Jamal, still grappling with the reality of the situation, was momentarily caught off guard by Lakeisha's sudden reappearance. His eyes widened in shock as he saw the knife in her hand. Before he could react or defend himself, Lakeisha lunged at him with a fierce, determined motion. The first strike landed with a sickening thud, and Jamal stumbled backward, his expression one of disbelief and pain. Driven by a blind, all-consuming rage, Lakeisha continued to attack. The knife plunged into Jamal repeatedly, each thrust fueled by the depth of her betrayal and heartbreak. The violence of the assault was brutal and relentless. The once clean kitchen floor was soon stained with blood, and the air was filled with the sounds of struggle and agony. Tamika, who had been paralyzed by the confrontation earlier, now found herself a horrifying witness to the murder. Her mind struggled to process the scene unfolding before her. The sight of her mother wielding the knife, the blood, and Jamal's agonized cries were too much for her to comprehend. The gravity of Lakeisha's actions began to sink in as she watched Jamal's life slip away. Her hands, covered in blood, trembled uncontrollably. The realization that she had just killed her husband, the man who had been a part of her life for years, was overwhelming. The intensity of her emotions, rage, guilt, and horror, collided in a way that left her paralyzed. She fell to her knees beside Jamal's lifeless body, her sobs echoing through the house. Tamika's shock turned into a profound sense of guilt and horror as she saw the bloodied scene before her. She had never imagined that her actions could lead to such a tragic outcome. Her stepfather was dead, and her mother was devastated, both as a result of a relationship she had helped to create. The weight of the responsibility and the fear of the consequences left her feeling utterly helpless. In the midst of the chaos, Lakeisha's emotions began to shift from rage to a more profound despair. The act she had committed was irreversible, and the realization of what she had done was crushing. Her hands were still gripping the knife, and the blood on the blade seemed to symbolize the finality of her actions. As the minutes ticked by, the reality of the situation settled in. Lakeisha knew she had to face the consequences of her actions, but she was unable to move from the scene of the crime. Tamika's own internal struggle was evident as she tried to make sense of what had happened, knowing that her mother's actions had forever altered their lives. The police arrived at the crime scene just minutes after Tamika's 911 call. The chaotic and tragic scene in the Williams home was met with immediate action from law enforcement. Lakeisha, still in shock and covered in blood, was quickly apprehended and taken into custody. The gravity of the situation was evident from the start, with Jamal's lifeless body lying in a pool of blood on the living room floor. As the initial shock of the murder settled, investigators began their work. The scene was thoroughly documented, and forensic experts worked to gather evidence. Lakeisha's arrest was followed by a detailed search of the Williams home, where detectives sought to uncover the motives and background behind the brutal crime. During the search, investigators uncovered a trove of evidence that shed light on the secretive relationship between Jamal and Tamika. Among the items found were a series of text messages, explicit photographs, and personal diaries belonging to both Jamal and Tamika. The messages between Jamal and Tamika were graphic and intimate, leaving no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The diaries provided further insight into their emotional state and the dynamics of their illicit affair. The discovery of this evidence painted a clear picture of the deep betrayal that Lakeisha had experienced. The messages and diaries detailed not only the nature of the affair but also the emotional manipulation and deceit that had been involved. This evidence was critical in understanding the motive behind the murder and the extent of the emotional turmoil that Lakeisha had faced. Lakeisha was formally charged with first-degree murder, a serious offense that carried significant legal consequences. The prosecution argued that the premeditated nature of the attack, combined with the evidence of the affair, pointed to a crime of extreme emotional distress but with clear intent. The legal proceedings were closely followed by the media, given the high-profile nature of the case and the tragic circumstances surrounding it. The trial took place in November 2016, several months after the murder. Lakeisha, now facing a courtroom filled with reporters, family members, and legal professionals, appeared somber and resigned. Her defense team argued that the killing was an act of temporary insanity, driven by the extreme emotional pain of discovering the affair. They contended that Lakeisha had acted out of a moment of uncontrollable rage rather than premeditated malice. Despite these arguments, the prosecution presented a compelling case. The evidence of the affair, combined with the brutal nature of the crime, led the jury to a swift verdict. The trial was emotionally charged, with testimonies from family members, forensic experts, and law enforcement painting a vivid picture of the events that had transpired. The jury found her guilty of first-degree murder on November 29, 2016. Lakeisha was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence was a reflection of the severity of the crime and the profound impact it had on everyone involved. The court's decision was met with mixed reactions, as some felt that Lakeisha's emotional distress was a mitigating factor, while others believed that justice had been served for Jamal's tragic death. For Tamika, the aftermath of the trial was a period of profound upheaval. The once vibrant young woman was now left to grapple with the aftermath of her family's disintegration. The guilt and trauma from witnessing her stepfather's murder and the realization of her role in the affair weighed heavily on her. The emotional and psychological impact of the events had left her feeling isolated and broken. Tamika's life, which had once held promise and potential, was now overshadowed by the tragedy that had befallen her family. The sense of guilt and horror was compounded by the public nature of the trial and the scrutiny she faced from the media and her peers. The loss of her mother to the prison system and the death of her stepfather left her with a fractured sense of identity and a future that seemed uncertain. In the months following the trial, Tamika struggled to find a path forward. The emotional scars left by the murder and the public fallout from the trial made it difficult for her to rebuild her life. She sought therapy and support to cope with the trauma and guilt, but the process of healing was slow and fraught with challenges. The Williams family story became a tragic case study in the consequences of betrayal and the fragility of human relationships. The investigation and trial had brought to light the dark and painful reality behind the family's seemingly perfect facade. For Lakeisha, Jamal, and Tamika, the events of 2014 and 2015 had irrevocably altered their lives, leaving a legacy of sorrow and regret that would endure for years to come.